Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906, in Plainfield, Wisconsin. His mother, Augustina, was notoriously religious and would give fervent sermons about how all women, apart from herself, were promiscuous and drove men to the devil. His father was known as the town's alcoholic and could not hold down a job to save his life, despite his family being in poverty. The rumor was that Augustina frequently drove her husband to drink through her incessant nagging. After failing in business once again, Ed's father moved the family out to an isolated farm in Plainfield, which would eventually become Ed's playground of horrors. The two boys attended some school, but Ed had a hard time adjusting, and his classmates frequently would be disturbed by his random outbursts of laughter. Ed and Henry's father died at the ripe old age of 66 due to his alcoholism, and Augusta had a tighter hold on her boys. Despite her sermons about the horrors of women and their promiscuity leading men to hell, Ed was reported to have adored his mother. After their father's death, the two boys took various odd jobs around town to help out their mother with expenses. Ed was reportedly much in demand as a babysitter. Reportedly, he felt much more easy around children than adults. Henry began dating a divorced woman with 2 children of her own. Divorce being a mortal sin in the eyes of Augusta, she and Ed were both furious when the truth came to light. On May 16, 1944, Henry and Ed were burning away some old vegetation on the property when the barn caught fire. The fire department was too late by the time they arrived, and Ed's brother was reported missing. With a search party that hunted for hours, Henry was eventually found lying face down. He appeared to have been dead for some time, possibly before the fire even started. His death was listed as apparent heart failure, though later it was reported that he had extensive bruising to the back of his head. The coroner eventually reported that asphyxiation was the cause of Henry's death, and no burns were noted on the body. After the death of Henry, there was only Augusta and Ed left of the family, and being alone on the isolated farm, they became more consumed with each other. Augusta suffered a stroke sometime after Henry's death and became partially paralyzed. Ed devoted his entire time to taking care of her and waiting on her hand and foot. Ed later recounted a story he had heard of his mother witnessing a beating of a dog by a neighbor and a woman outside of their home. Augusta later told Ed her disgust at seeing the scene, but her focus was on the woman. Apparently, the neighbor was not married to the woman. The dog being beaten had little to do with her sensibilities. Augusta suffered a second stroke that ultimately ended her life, and Ed was now officially alone in the world. According to a later biographer, he stated that he had lost his only friend and one true love. Being now alone in the world, Ed boarded up the majority of the rooms in the house that his mother had once used, keeping them pristinely clean, and living in a small room by the kitchen. Around this time, Ed began collecting magazines that focused on cannibalism, Nazi atrocities, rape, and murder. Later, it was also found Ed had collected a substantial stash of violent pornography. Ed became consumed with the thoughts of his mother and began roaming the rooms that had once belonged to her and fondly remembering all the times she had insisted they sleep in the same bed. One night he drove into town to the local tavern, and Mary Hogan was later reported missing. Ed began scanning the local newspapers looking for recently deceased women whose corpse he could dig up without anyone finding out. Reportedly, there were 2 middle-aged women he dug up that very closely resembled his mother. Later in his testimony, Ed reported about 40 nocturnal visits to the graveyard and overall taking about 9 corpses back to his house of horrors, though the real number remains unknown. Ed evaded notice of the police until 1957. A hardware store owner, Bernice Warden, had gone missing, and when her son came to open the shop, he discovered Ed had been the last customer and was due to return. Upon closer inspection, he found blood stains on the floor and possibly leading towards the back of the store. Ed was arrested the very same day, and the sheriff's department went out to search the farm in hopes of finding the missing lady. One of the sheriff's deputies swung open the door to the barn and was greeted with Bernice Warden's body hung like a deer, and her head was missing. As the sheriff's department searched the house, they uncovered more and more horrors of Ed's sick fantasies. Upon searching the house, the authorities found whole human bones and fragments of bones, a wastebasket made of human skin that covered several chair seats, skulls on his bedpost, female skulls that had some of their tops sawn off, bowls made from human skulls, a corset made from a female torso that had been skinned from the shoulders to the waist, leggings made from human skin, masks made from the skin of female heads, Mary Hogan's face in a paper bag, and Mary Hogan's skull in a box, Bernice Warden's entire head in a burlap sack, and her heart on a plate in front of the stove. 9 vulva in a shoebox, a young girl's dress, and the vulvas of 2 females judged to be between 13 or 15. A belt made from human female nipples, 4 noses, a pair of lips on a window shade drawstring, a lampshade made from the skin of a human face, fingernails from female fingers, and an entire skin suit made from women's skin. With all of these ghoulish trophies, the sheriffs were struggling to count the number of women that Ed had killed and mutilated. An interesting point arose as the case began to take shape, and it became apparent that visitors had seen some of Ed's horrible trophies, but he had laughed it off and claimed a cousin who had fought in Japan had sent them to him as sort of horrible war trophies to keep in his memory. It is alleged that one of the sheriff's deputies hit or punched Ed during his questioning, especially in regards to the genitalia found of the young females. Reportedly, his family said he was so traumatized by what he had found in Ed's house that it contributed to his death shortly after, and he was just as much a victim of Ed's brutality and horror as the women had been. The trial began on November 21st, 1957. He was charged with 1 count of first-degree murder, the murder of Bernice Warden, and he pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. He was diagnosed with schizophrenia, found mentally incompetent to stand trial, and sent to a maximum security state hospital for the criminally insane. Now, the institution still stands as the Dodge Correctional Institution. It wasn't until 1968 that doctors determined he was mentally competent to stand trial, and his new trial began on November 7th, 1968. Over an entire decade from when the crime had originally taken place. Ed claims that the gun that killed Bernice Warden had accidentally gone off in his hand, and declined to answer anything about the mutilation that occurred afterwards, claiming he had no memory of what had occurred after the gun accidentally went off in his hand. The defense had somehow convinced the court to hold the trial without a jury, and on November 14th, he was found guilty, and yet The second trial dealt with his sanity afterwards. After the testimony of multiple doctors, he was ruled not guilty by reason of insanity and committed for the rest of his life to a mental hospital. Ed was not charged for any other murders due to the court claiming it would cost too much. However, it seems that the town of Plainfield did have their revenge in the end. Ed's possessions, farm, barn, and all the land that remained were set to be auctioned on March 30th, 1958, and there were rumors that the house was set to be turned into a tourist attraction. Early on the morning of March 20th, the house and the barn mysteriously caught fire. The sheriff's department and the fire marshal said that arson was suspected, but no one was arrested or charged with the crime. One of the only remaining relics of Ed's horrors that we know of is his 1949 sedan, which he reportedly used to haul the bodies of his graveyard victims away. It was sold at a public auction for around $760, and a carnival sideshow man, Bunny Gibbons, charged goers 25 cents admission to see it, but the whereabouts of it are unknown as of today. Ed died on July 26, 1984, from lung cancer. The institute claimed he was a model patient, yet later the female workers would tell a different tale, recounting the horror they would feel whenever they would turn and see Ed's gaze staring at them, which happened far too often. In 1959, the case gained more attention due to a young author named Robert Bloch basing, allegedly, his new novel Psycho on the case, and notably, one of the most detestable villains of cinema and fiction was born, that being the character of Norman Bates.